She spent every dollar she had on a rusted-out World War II patrol boat. No engine, no paperwork, and barely seaworthy. Everyone said it was a mistake, a floating graveyard of broken bolts and forgotten battles. But hidden behind a sealed bulkhead was something no one had seen in over 80 years, a truth so buried it was never meant to resurface. What began as a passion project turned into the discovery of a lifetime and a chapter of history waiting to be rewritten. Before we dive into this unbelievable journey, tell us where you're watching from. And if stories of hidden pasts, bold women, and impossible finds light you up, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode, it's even more jaw-dropping than this one. Let's get started. The listing was almost a joke. Retired naval patrol boat, salvage only, buyer responsible for transport. Most bidders ignored it, scrolling past like it was an old couch left on the curb. But not Riley Hale. She sat in the back of the county auction hall, boots dusty, ponytail frayed from the shop, and a clipboard balanced on her knees. Her savings were thin, just over $14,000 scraped together from a year's worth of overtime, side jobs, and skipped meals. She wasn't there for a car or even a trailer. She came to watch, maybe bid on spare machinery. But when the projector screen flicked to a grainy image of a long-forgotten vessel tied to a sun-bleached dock, her heart caught. It was ugly rust bleeding down the sides like tears, windows blacked with grime, deck planks split like weathered scars. But something in its stance, the way it still sat with dignity on the water, bow tilted slightly forward like it was still ready for orders, it hit her. Not like curiosity, like gravity. She raised her number. Lot 113, the auctioneer barked. Opening bid at $1,000. Silence. Someone laughed near the front. She didn't blink. 1,000. The room turned to see who'd spoken. She kept her eyes on the screen. 1,000. Going once. Going twice. Are you serious? A man muttered from 2 rows over. That thing's a floating coffin. Sold to the young lady in the back. The gavel cracked like a starter pistol. Riley exhaled, slow and quiet. She had just bought a warship. Later, as the crowd trickled out and the auctioneer handed her a clipboard with faded registration notes, she asked the obvious. Is there a title? The man scratched his head. No record of one. But the naval ID's still visible. World War II era, supposedly. Never saw action. Most of these were used for coastal patrols or radio relay. He shrugged, probably stripped decades ago. But Riley barely heard him. She was already thinking about logistics tow companies, dry dock rentals, where to park it without going bankrupt. It wasn't a smart purchase. She knew that. She could hear her father's voice in her head, calm and dry. You don't buy ghosts, kid. You fix the living. But maybe, just maybe, this ghost wanted fixing too. 3 days later, she stood at the edge of the marina, with the wind in her face and a heavy chain of regret coiled tight in her chest. The warship, or what was left of it, rocked gently at the far end of Dock 7. Flakes of red-brown paint curled off its hull like peeling skin. Seagulls stood sentry along the mast, squawking like they disapproved of her presence. She stepped aboard anyway. The deck creaked under her boots. The air was thick with salt, oil, and rusted memory. It smelled like forgotten stories. She ran her fingers along the edge of the wheelhouse door. The metal was cool and pitted, but solid, just like her. Let's see what secrets you're hiding, she whispered, and the ship, silent for decades, seemed to listen. The first night aboard the ship was colder than Riley expected. She'd brought a sleeping bag, a battery-powered lantern, and a box of tools, but no amount of gear could soften the echoing loneliness inside the old patrol boat. The hull groaned with every ripple of the tide, steel stretching like old bones remembering their aches. Somewhere deep below deck, something shifted with a metallic clank, maybe a loose panel, maybe something else. But Riley didn't flinch. She'd worked alone in darker places. She laid her sleeping bag out in the wheelhouse, right under a broken radio panel still crusted with salt. Through the cracked windows, she could just see the marina lights flickering against the black water. The rest of the boat was a maze of half-collapsed ladders, rust-choked corridors, and sealed hatches that hadn't been opened in half a century. But she didn't feel fear. She felt pulled. The next morning, her boots hit the deck before sunrise. No coffee, no breakfast, just gloves on and focus sharp. She started with the obvious. Assessing the hull integrity, scraping loose rust, checking weld points. The engine room was a joke, completely gutted. Someone had stripped the original diesel engines clean down to their mounts. That alone meant the ship would never sail again, at least not without a small fortune. But Riley hadn't bought it to sail. She bought it to wake it up. Back at the shop, her life had become repetitive. Oil changes, engine rebuilds, transmission swaps, always fixing the same broken parts on different machines. Customers came in with problems. She sent them home with solutions. It paid the bills, but it never fed her soul. This boat, this thing was different. It didn't just need fixing, it needed resurrecting. By mid-morning, she was under the main deck, flashlight clamped between her teeth, tracing the seams of a sealed bulkhead near the forward hold. It was different from the others. Welded shut in jagged, uneven lines like it had been done quickly. Sloppily. Not regulation. Not original. She ran her fingers over the welds. "Why would they seal this from the inside?" she muttered. She tried her grinder on it. Sparks flew. Metal screamed, but it held. Too thick to cut without the right blades. She'd need to come back with better gear, maybe even torch it. But something about that panel didn't feel right. It was like the ship had a locked drawer, and the key was buried in its bones. As she climbed out, a shadow moved near the dock, just a gull taking flight. But it startled her enough to turn. That's when she noticed the man watching from the edge of the marina. Mid-60 seconds, maybe. Navy cap pulled low. Hands in pockets. He didn't say a word. Just nodded once, turned, and walked away. Riley watched him go. Uneasy and curious. Back aboard the ship, she stood at the bow, wind tearing through her jacket. She'd always dreamed of building something no one else would dare to touch. She just never expected that something would already have a soul. Riley returned the next morning with a plasma cutter, heavier gloves, and a thermos of coffee she barely touched. The marina was quiet, only the lapping of water and the creak of dock lines against old cleats breaking the stillness. She moved through the patrol boat, like it was breathing slowly, respectfully. This wasn't a workspace anymore. It was a tomb with a heartbeat. She descended below deck, the cold steel ladder groaning under her boots. The sealed bulkhead waited for her, still slick with yesterday's grind marks. She stared at it for a long moment before flipping down her visor and firing the cutter to life. Bright blue fire licked along the welds, melting time away inch by inch. The scent of burning paint filled the corridor, thick and bitter. It took nearly an hour before the steel panel gave. A final hiss, a dull pop, and the edge pulled free. Riley stepped back as the plate dropped with a clang, echoing through the hull like a warning bell. She killed the cutter and pulled her visor up, letting the silence settle again. Then she clicked on her flashlight and stepped through the breach. The air shifted, still and dry. No ocean dampness, no mold, just dust. Heavy, settled, untouched. Inside was a narrow room, maybe 15 feet long, ceiling low enough to make her crouch. The walls were lined with lockers, all sealed, some labeled in faded stencils. In the far corner sat a steel crate, reinforced, padlocked shut. A single wooden chair rested next to it, broken at one leg, like someone had sat there long ago and left in a hurry. Riley moved slowly. Her light caught something etched into the wall above the crate, hand-carved letters, deep and deliberate. For those who never came home. Her breath caught. She reached for the padlock but stopped short. Instead, she pulled her phone from her jacket, took a few photos, then stood back, heart pounding in her ears. Whatever this was, it wasn't standard storage, it wasn't equipment, and it wasn't meant to be found casually. She left the room untouched and resealed the panel loosely behind her, just enough to keep curious hands away. Back in the wheelhouse, she sat down hard on the old captain's bench, fingers drumming against her thigh. It was supposed to be a project, a rebuild, something to keep her hands busy and her spirit sharper than her tools. Now? It felt like she'd stepped into someone else's unfinished mission. She scrolled through the photos on her phone again, zooming in on the etched message. Something was wrong with the official story. This ship hadn't just been mothballed. It had been hidden, and someone, maybe that man at the dock, knew it. She looked out at the horizon, wind pushing against the windows. The warship was talking, and for the first time, Riley wasn't sure she wanted to hear everything it had to say. The town library wasn't where Riley expected to spend her day off, but she needed answers, and Google wasn't cutting it. She stood at the microfiche machine with a headache already pulsing behind her eyes. A stack of yellowed naval registries and decommission reports lay beside her, pulled by a half-curious, half-confused librarian who said, "No one's looked at these in years." Riley offered only a distracted thanks and kept scrolling. She was looking for any record of the boat, its original name, crew, missions, anything. The only identifier she had was a serial stenciled onto the inside of the wheelhouse, PBL 31. No ship name, no plaque. Just those letters and numbers, faded almost to nothing. 2 hours in, she found it. A brief line in a 1944 fleet roster. PBL 31, Coastal Interceptor. Commissioned May 1943. Deployed, confidential. Decommissioned, status unknown. Status unknown? That wasn't normal. Most vessels had a record of final assignment, sale, or scrapping. This one? Nothing. Like it had just stopped existing. She jotted it down and kept digging. In the next stack, she unearthed a set of shipyard blueprints. Actual prints. Not scans of patrol boats from the 1942nd. They weren't a perfect match, but close enough. She ran her finger down one particular schematic that detailed a secondary forward compartment marked for classified storage. It matched the space behind the sealed bulkhead. Suddenly, she remembered the padlock on the steel crate and the phrase etched into the wall. For those who never came home, that wasn't military issue, that was personal. By the time the sun dipped low outside the library windows, Riley's notebook was full of scribbles, timelines, and questions she couldn't answer. One thing was clear. PBL 30. One had been involved in something it wasn't supposed to be, and someone had gone to great lengths to erase it. Back on the boat that evening, she climbed into the wheelhouse and dropped the binder of blueprints onto the bench. The ship creaked beneath her, reacting to the shifting tide. For a moment, it almost felt like a sigh. "I know you've got a story," she whispered. "I just haven't figured out why they buried it." She flipped through the blueprints again, stopping at the forward hold. According to this, there had been an internal communications relay installed unusual for a ship its size. And, more unusual, a narrow tunnel running below the floor of the sealed room. She looked up at the empty ceiling of the wheelhouse. It was dark now, wind pressing in hard from the sea. Somewhere out there was someone who knew more, maybe, that silent veteran from the dock. And maybe, just maybe, he was waiting to see if she would stop. But Riley Hale had never been one to back down when the bolts started fighting, especially not when history was clawing its way back through the steel. Riley was back under the bulkhead when she heard the knock. It wasn't loud, just the soft thunk of knuckles against steel, followed by a pause, then again. She wiped her hands, slid the welding mask off her face, and climbed up through the main hatch. The wind was sharper than usual, and the marina was mostly empty. A man stood at the end of the dock, same one she'd seen before, tall, silver-haired, shoulders squared with the kind of posture that only years in uniform could teach. His navy cap was cleaner this time, his boots polished. But his eyes, they were tired, not from age, from carrying something for too long. Riley stepped off the boat, cautiously. "Can I help you?" He gave a small nod, hands still in his coat pockets. "You opened it, didn't you?" She froze. "The bulkhead?" He glanced past her toward the ship. "I served on that boat. 1963. 10 years after she was supposed to be retired. But she wasn't." Riley blinked. Wait, the records say she was decommissioned in 45. He chuckled, without humor. Yeah, that's what they wanted people to believe. She motioned toward the wheelhouse. Come aboard. He hesitated, then slowly climbed the gangplank. As his boots touched the deck, Riley watched something shift in his face, like a weight that had waited years to be felt again. I'm Riley, she offered. Elias Finch, he said, shaking her hand. His grip was dry and firm. Petty officer, 2nd class, radio operations. Inside the wheelhouse, he ran his fingers along the radio panel, the one Riley had planned to rip out. This ship, Elias began, voice low, was part of something called Operation Hollow Current. Covert communication runs off the Gulf. Unofficial, unsanctioned. We transmitted. We listened. We never spoke of it again. Why the secrecy? Because we weren't supposed to be here. The war had ended, but not the games. Cold War chessboard, you know? He tapped the panel lightly. We intercepted things we weren't supposed to. Heard voices we weren't meant to. Riley pulled out her phone and showed him the photo of the etched message in the sealed compartment. His face tightened. I carved that, he said softly. Her breath caught. There was a mission. 1964. We picked up a signal. Faint. Fractured. We followed it into open waters. The storm hit hard, and one of the crew, Daniels, went below to check wiring. The compartment sealed behind him. Never opened again. Officially? Mechanical failure? Unofficially? He trailed off. Riley pressed gently. What was the signal? Elias stared out at the harbor. It wasn't American. That's all I'll say. And it wasn't supposed to be there. She looked at him for a long moment. Why come now? He turned toward her, his eyes sharp despite the years. Because you opened the door. And because history doesn't stay buried forever, not if someone's willing to listen. Outside, gulls circled the mast, like they knew something was stirring. And deep below deck, the warship's secrets waited for light. That night, Riley couldn't sleep. The ship groaned softly in the current, ropes straining against the dock with every swell. She lay in her sleeping bag on the wheelhouse floor, the same floor Elias Finch had stood on hours earlier. His words replayed like radio static in her mind. History doesn't stay buried forever. She sat up around 2 a.m., unable to ignore the itch in her chest. The kind that said, "You missed something." With a headlamp strapped on, and the rest of the harbor swallowed in darkness, she climbed back down to the sealed room. The hatch still sat partially pried open from her last session, revealing that cramped, haunting space lined with lockers and dust. She stepped in slowly, careful not to disturb anything. The air was heavier now, not just from time or rust, but from memory. She knelt in front of the steel crate. The padlock still hung tight, but the hinges were old. She picked up her pry bar and wedged it beneath the edge. It didn't take much, a few hard pulls, and the hasp snapped free. Inside was a canvas bag, oil-stained and brittle. She unzipped it and found a reel-to-reel audio recorder, a bundle of tightly coiled cables, a notebook, pages fragile and yellowing. She opened the notebook first. The handwriting was cramped, rushed. Ship logs, but not standard. No dates, just timestamps. Entries like 0213 hours, signal repeating. Same modulation. 0430 hours, Daniel says it's getting louder. 0517 hours, static. Then a voice. Not ours, not theirs. Riley swallowed hard. These weren't notes. They were warnings. She powered on the recorder. The tape spun slowly, gears whining as if waking from a deep sleep. The static came first, loud, crackling. Then something under it, faint, like someone breathing through a mouthful of water. Then the voice, not clear, not in English, but deliberate, cadenced, almost chanting. It sent a chill through her spine. She hit stop and sat back, heart pounding. This wasn't just a transmission log. This was evidence. Something had been intercepted. Something that wasn't supposed to exist. Maybe not even from this side of the war. Maybe not even from this side of the ocean. As dawn crept through the cracks in the bulkhead, Riley gathered the items and carried them into the wheelhouse. She laid them out on the bench and stared at them as the sun began to rise. She had started with rust and broken bolts. Now she had a voice no one could identify, a dead man locked behind a welded panel, and a patrol ship that was never supposed to be found. But something in her deeper than logic, deeper than fear, told her this wasn't just a coincidence. She wasn't rebuilding a ship. She was excavating a cover-up, and the deeper she went, the more the steel seemed to whisper back. The sun was still rising when Riley made her decision. She didn't eat, didn't drink, just slipped her tools into a canvas bag, threw on her jacket, and headed straight for the forward hold. She had studied the blueprints too many times now to miss it, a narrow crawl space that ran beneath the sealed room. It hadn't been listed on standard records, only in the older, classified schematics buried at the back of that naval binder. The entrance was under a warped floor panel, bolted shut with stripped screws and years of grime. It took nearly an hour to break it loose, but once she had, the floor groaned open like a sigh from the ship itself. Beneath was darkness deeper, quieter, and colder than the rest of the vessel. She lowered herself in feet first, flashlight clamped in her teeth, knees scraping against corroded steel as she slid into the narrow passage. The air was dry, the kind of dry you only get when something's been sealed for decades. Her light flicked across the walls. No wires, no piping, just raw metal and silence. Then her beam caught something ahead, another hatch, smaller, hand-sized, and covered in a thick, crusted layer of salt. She brushed it off and saw something strange. Not a serial number, not an inventory mark, but a symbol. A triangle with a single line running through it. Carved, not stamped. Deliberate. She hesitated only a moment before turning the latch. It opened with a hiss, like air escaping a wound. Inside was a cavity no bigger than a storage locker. And in it, wrapped in waxed cloth, was a bundle of items untouched by time. A sealed envelope marked confidential. Naval eyes only. A silver identification tag, and an old sidearm wrapped in oilcloth, still sharp, with a scent of gunpowder and grease. But what held her breath hostage wasn't the gun. It was the envelope. She pulled it out carefully and climbed back into the daylight, setting everything gently on the wheelhouse bench. The paper was stiff, edges browned, the seal brittle. She peeled it open and unfolded the contents. Inside was a letter, typed on a manual machine. No date, no signature, just one stark paragraph. The signal did not originate from friendly or known sources. Continued transmission intercepts suggest intelligence of non-terrestrial or post-theater origin. Recommend full compartmentalization. Vessel to be reclassified and buried in domestic marina. No further inquiry. She read it again. And again. The words didn't make sense, or maybe they did, and that's what terrified her. Non-terrestrial? She looked out the wheelhouse window, past the pier, past the shoreline. The world felt smaller now, like she'd cracked open something ancient and forgotten, and it had seen her. She had bought a warship, but what she'd really purchased was the secret it had been trusted to drown, and now, that secret was hers. The news broke faster than she ever intended. Riley hadn't planned to tell anyone. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But her hand was forced when the historian from the Naval Museum in Charleston returned her call. She had reached out days earlier, before discovering the hidden compartment, just to confirm the ship's ID tag. Now, that same historian, Dr. Eva Maddox, was on the other end of the line, her voice tight with urgency. "Where exactly did you say you found this vessel?" Eva asked. "Dock 7. Savannah Harbor," Riley replied. "Private auction. It was listed as surplus scrap." There was a pause. Then, "I just spoke to someone at the Department of Defense." Riley stiffened. "Why?" "Because this ship doesn't exist. Not on paper. Not in any registry. They didn't even want to acknowledge your photo. Said it was misidentified. That's code for 'we buried this.'" Riley leaned against the bulkhead, suddenly aware of every creak, every wave hitting the hull. Eva continued. You need to be careful. If you've found what I think you've found, there are people who've spent decades making sure no one ever would. Riley didn't sleep that night. By morning, her phone had 5 missed calls from blocked numbers. The email she'd sent with scanned images of the letter, the recorder, and the sealed logbook had somehow triggered attention she never asked for. One of the replies wasn't even signed. Just a line of text. Cease further investigation. For your safety. She wanted to believe it was fake. A hoax. Maybe someone trolling her. But that didn't explain the black SUV parked across from the marina at 4 a.m. Or the 2 men in dark jackets who walked the dock that morning, pretending not to glance at the patrol boat as they passed by twice slow, silent. Riley felt the walls closing in. But then came the email from Eva again. This time with a subject line. You're not alone. Inside was a list of coordinates and a meeting location. A diner, an hour inland. Private. Quiet. Others have been asking questions too, Eva had written. You're not the only one who's uncovered pieces. That night, Riley sat alone in the booth, greasy coffee cup in hand, waiting. When Eva arrived, she wasn't alone. She brought a man in his 70s, lean, weathered, and silent until he saw the photocopy Riley had laid on the table. The letter. The words, non-terrestrial. He paled. This was never supposed to see daylight. Why? Riley asked. Because if the truth ever got out, he said, his voice low, they'd have to admit we were wrong about what we heard. About who we heard. Riley leaned forward. What was the signal? He looked her straight in the eyes. It wasn't just a transmission. He tapped her finger on the letter. It was a response, and just like that, Riley realized she wasn't at the end of a mystery. She was at the beginning of something bigger than history itself. By the end of the week, the story had leaked. Riley didn't know how. Maybe someone from the diner, maybe the museum, or maybe the government had let it slip on purpose. Either way, headlines started trickling out from fringe websites first, then jumped to bigger platforms. Mechanic discovers World War II ship with classified secrets. Hidden hatch, lost mission, and a message from beyond? Whistleblower warns of buried naval truth. Some called it a hoax. Others called her a hero. She hated both. Riley had never wanted attention. All she wanted was to restore something broken. But now she was the subject of conspiracy forums, morning talk shows, and one local news crew that showed up at the marina uninvited, filming over the dock until she told them to leave or get wet. But not everyone was trying to exploit the story. Letters began arriving at the shop. Some typed, some handwritten. Veterans, historians, sons and daughters of long-dead crewmen. A woman from Maine wrote that her grandfather used to talk in his sleep about a ghost frequency he picked up in the Pacific. A retired sailor from Pensacola said he once boarded a ship like Riley's but was pulled off by officers before he even stepped into the hold. They thanked her for digging deeper, for listening when no one else would. But for every thank you, there was a threat. 3 cease and desist notices arrived within 48 hours, none officially from the military, but all on behalf of shadowy-sounding advisory groups. One warned her not to tamper with defense-sensitive materials. Another accused her of violating an act she'd never even heard of. The third simply said, "We know where the recorder is. Return it, and this ends." Riley burned that one in the oil drum behind her shop. She had always been good at fixing broken things. But this was something different, bigger, heavier, like standing between a dam and the flood. And still, she didn't back down. She contacted a lawyer one she trusted, a woman named Grace who had once helped her save the garage after her dad died. Grace didn't flinch. If they had real authority, they'd have acted by now, she said. You have something they buried that scares them more than it scares you. Still, Riley couldn't sleep. The ship sat dark most nights now, her visits growing more cautious. But one night, as she stepped aboard under the moonlight, she noticed something different. Someone had left a coin on the wheelhouse bench. Old. Worn smooth. A sailor's coin, the kind handed out before deployment, engraved with a ship's crest, and a silent prayer. But this one had something etched on the back in shaky, hand-scratched letters. "Don't stop. You're the first one listening." She stood there for a long time, holding it in her palm like it was pulsing. They wanted her silent, but the ship, the voice, the letters, they needed her loud. And tomorrow, she'd speak. The morning was calm. No reporters, no SUVs, just gulls wheeling silently overhead in the soft ripple of the tide against the rusted hull. Riley stood at the bow of the ship, wind tugging at her jacket, the horizon wide and open ahead. Today was the day she'd been building toward, not to finish a restoration, but to make the world see what had been ignored for too long. The warship had been cleaned, patched, repainted in places not for beauty but for truth. She left the scarring visible, the welds unpolished. The sealed hatch, now rebolted, remained as it was, with one difference: a plaque she'd bolted next to it, dedicated to Daniels, and every voice buried by silence. At noon, a small crowd gathered at the dock. Not journalists, not government officials, just people, locals, veterans. A boy with a toy ship in his hand, an old woman in a Navy widow's shawl, and Elias Finch, standing near the gangway, his arms folded, his eyes unreadable. Riley stepped forward and began to speak, voice firm but human. She told them about the auction, about the sealed room, the recorder, the letter. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't claim aliens or cover-ups. She spoke plainly, honestly, and with a deep kind of reverence. This ship was built to patrol, to protect. But somewhere along the way, it was asked to carry more than its crew. It was asked to carry secrets, and it did, quietly, until now. She paused, holding up the sailor's coin someone had left her. "I think we owe it to the people who served, and those who were silenced, to at least ask why, and to remember what was never meant to be forgotten." The dock fell quiet. Then Elias stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. He looked out at the crowd, then back at the ship. "I was just a kid when I stepped aboard this vessel," he said. "I didn't know what I was signing up for. None of us did. But I know what I heard, and I know that if Riley hadn't found her, none of you would be here. So if you want to thank someone," he turned to her, "thank the girl who listened." A few clapped, then more, until the applause filled the space between the dock and the deck like waves. Riley didn't cry, but she did let herself smile, not for the cameras, not for the recognition, just for the peace. Weeks later, the ship was towed to a naval memorial site, not buried in paperwork or auction slips, but displayed proudly, plaque intact. People came to see her not for engines or cannons, but for the silence she once held. Riley returned home quietly, back to her shop, back to grease and gears. But things were different now. She wasn't just a mechanic. She was a witness. And as she stood beneath the evening sky, looking up at the same stars that had once shone down on a forgotten patrol boat at sea, she understood the truth. Some legacies don't sail away. Some are set adrift, so they can finally be found.